On a limestone slope in southern France, water hits the top of a wheel and the whole hillside wakes up. 16 wheels stacked in 2 columns of 8, each basin spilling into the one below it, gears biting, millstones screaming against grain. No fire, no smoke. No ox straining in a harness, no slave chained to a grinding pole. Just water falling downhill, and at the bottom of that slope, flour pours out by the ton, fast enough to feed a small city before sundown. This machine was already running in the 2nd century. 1700 years before the Industrial Revolution, the Romans had already built a factory, and it ran on the one thing nobody could send them a bill for. You don't have that. You pay for power on the 1st of every month. You watch the number climb every summer when the air conditioning runs, and every winter when it doesn't keep up. When a storm takes the line down, your house goes dark and silent, and you wait, helpless, for a crew you've never met to decide when your life turns back on. You are renting your own electricity from people who would very much like you to keep renting it. And the strange part, the part that should bother you, is that the most dependable power source human beings ever built isn't lost technology. It isn't a mystery. It still works right now exactly as well as it ever did. We just walked away from it. The question that should be sitting in your chest by the end of this is not how did they do it. It's who decided you should stop. Start with the wheel itself, because it's simpler than the thing you plug into the wall, and that's the whole point. The best version the Romans built is called an overshot wheel. Water is carried along a channel to the very top of the wheel and dropped into buckets on the rim. The weight of the water, not its speed, its sheer falling weight, pulls the loaded side down, and the wheel turns, and it keeps turning for as long as the stream keeps coming. And a decent stream comes back season after season with no fuel and no bill. A wheel like that converts the energy in falling water at efficiencies that embarrass most machines you own. Built well, an overshot wheel reaches somewhere around 70 to 85%. Your car engine burning gasoline throws most of its energy away as heat and never sees half that figure. This was one of the first times in history a society had a serious source of mechanical power that didn't come from a muscle. Not a man's, not a horse's, not an ox's. For every previous civilization, energy meant a living thing getting tired. The wheel didn't get tired, it worked while you slept. And the people who first felt that shift understood exactly what they were looking at. Around 20 BC, a Greek poet named Antipater of Thessalonica wrote a few lines that read less like poetry and more like the first reaction to automation ever recorded. He tells the women who spent their whole lives grinding grain by hand at dawn to put the stone down and go back to sleep. The water spirits, he says, have taken over the work. He's not being cute. He's describing real women whose backs and hands had been freed by a wheel, and he calls it a return to the golden age, the age myths promised, where the earth gives food without anyone breaking their body for it. 2,000 years ago, a man looked at a water wheel and saw the end of human drudgery. We're taught the ancients didn't care about labor-saving machines because they had slaves to do the work. That poem is a hole in that story you could drive a cart through. They cared. They wrote songs about it. What they did with the wheel next is where the comfortable version of history starts to crack. In a city in what's now Turkey, in the 3rd century, somebody connected a water wheel to a saw, not a rotating blade, a saw that had to push and pull back and forth, while the wheel only knew how to spin in a circle. To make a spinning motion into a pushing and pulling motion, the builder used a crank and a connecting rod. That exact pairing, crank and connecting rod, is the mechanism living inside every piston engine ever made. The thing under the hood of your car, the heart of the steam engine that supposedly launched the modern world. The earliest known machine that combined those two parts wasn't built in the Industrial Revolution. It was a Roman stone saw, and the discovery pushed the invention of that mechanism back by 1,000 years. We only know it existed because of a man named Ammianos. He ran the mill. He was so proud of his water-powered saw that when he died, he had a carving of it cut into his own tombstone. The wheel, the gears, the blades, so that anyone standing over his grave would know what he had built. A working engineer, gone for 17 centuries, left us the blueprint as his epitaph. This is the moment to notice that nobody handed this technology around as a single secret. It kept reappearing, sometimes carried along trade routes, sometimes invented from scratch by people who barely knew the other end of the world existed. Half a world away in China, an official named Du Shi attached a water wheel to the bellows of an iron furnace in the year 31. Smelting iron means forcing air into a fire, over and over, hard enough to melt metal. Brutal, endless physical labor, normally done by men or horses pumping until they dropped. Du Shi let the river do it, water-powered heavy industry, making iron roughly 1,000 years before Europe figured out the same trick. The pattern is unmistakable. The moment a culture got a water wheel, it stopped using it for one job and started pointing it at everything. The ceiling of what the wheel could do isn't a grindstone or a furnace at all. It's a clock. In 1088, a Chinese statesman named Su Song built a tower roughly 40 feet tall, and the entire thing ran on water. Inside, falling water turned a wheel that drove gears that tracked the sun and the stars across the sky in real time. It told the hour. It rang it too. 133 little carved figures that appeared on schedule to sound the time with bells and drums. It used an escapement, the regulating mechanism that would define every mechanical clock in history, and the oldest known endless power chain to carry the force upward through the tower. A water-driven astronomical computer, centuries before mechanical clocks reached Europe. The wheel wasn't just strong, it was precise enough to measure the heavens. So this is the thing they took from you. Not a crude village curiosity, but a power source flexible enough to grind your grain, cut your stone, forge your iron, and keep time with the cosmos, all without burning a single thing. It was also nearly impossible to kill, which a Gothic army learned the hard way. In 537, the Goths laid siege to Rome and went for the city's throat. They cut the aqueducts. The mills that fed Rome sat on a hill and ran on aqueduct water, and now that water was gone. Starve the mills, starve the city, end the siege. It was a sound plan. It lasted about as long as it took the Byzantine general Belisarius to look at the river running straight through his city. He had mills built onto boats, anchored them in the Tiber, where the current ran fastest near the bridge pilings, and let the river itself spin the wheels. The enemy could cut every aqueduct in Italy, and the Tiber would not stop flowing. The bread kept coming, and the city held out. And the floating mill he improvised under siege didn't die when the siege ended. It escaped into the world. Within decades, it turned up in Paris, then Geneva, then Dijon. It reached the Islamic world, where ship mills moored in the Tigris at Mosul reportedly ground 10 tons of flour a day to feed Baghdad. On the Tiber itself, mills floated and turned for more than 1,300 years. A wartime hack outlived the empire that invented it by over a millennium. You can cut a wire. You can shut off a pipeline. You cannot, it turns out, easily switch off a river, and the people who depended on these wheels knew it. They kept finding new water to steal. On a tidal inlet in Ireland, monks went after the ocean. At Nendrum, on Strangford Lough, the monks built a mill that ran on the tide, dated to the year 619, the oldest tide mill ever dug out of the ground anywhere on Earth. The mechanism is almost insolent in its cleverness. They let the rising tide flow into a holding pond and trapped it behind a dam. When the tide went back out, they released the pond through the wheel. They were, in the most literal sense, running their grain mill on the gravity of the moon. The same pull that lifts the entire ocean twice a day was turning a millstone in a monastery before England had a single stone cathedral. Hold that image against the title of this video for a second. We treat tidal power and solar power as cutting edge, frontier energy, the stuff of research budgets and press releases. Monks were doing one of them in the 7th century with a wooden wheel and a pond. And the proof isn't even subtle. A modern tidal power turbine was later installed in the entrance to that exact same lough, harvesting the exact same current for the exact same reason the monks chose that spot 1,400 years ago. We didn't discover that water, we rediscovered it after forgetting on purpose. By the time the technology was mature, it wasn't a marvel anymore, it was infrastructure, a power grid made of wood and stone, owned at the level of the village. When the Normans conquered England, they counted what they'd taken in a survey so total and so feared that people called it the Domesday Book, the Book of Judgment. Buried in that 1086 ledger is a number that tells you what England actually ran on. More than 6,000 mills. That's over 99% of every mill known to have existed in the country before that century ended. Roughly 1 mill for every 2 villages in all of England, a nation of 1 to 2 million people. And the machines that fed them weren't owned by a distant company. They sat on the local stream in walking distance, turning whether or not anyone in London approved. So here is the answer to the question I left you with at the start. The reason a free, eternal, decentralized power source got quietly retired. Look again at why the Normans counted those mills. They weren't taking an engineering census. The Domesday Book was a tax document. They counted the mills because they intended to tax the mills. And across medieval Europe, that's exactly what happened. The lord owned the mill, and his peasants were forbidden to grind their own grain at home. Hand mills were confiscated and smashed. You brought your grain to the lord's wheel, and the lord took his cut of your flour, every time, forever. The water was free, the river was free, but the choke point, the wheel everyone was forced to use, that was owned, and whoever owned it owned a piece of every loaf of bread in the valley. That is the whole game. And it never changed, it only got bigger. A water wheel on your own stream is a catastrophe for anyone whose business is selling you energy, because there's no choke point. You can't meter a river running through someone's backyard. You can't shut it off for non-payment. You can't put your logo on the moon's gravity. When coal and steam arrived and then the centralized electrical grid, the pitch wasn't really that they worked better. Early steam engines were filthy, finicky, and far less efficient than a good overshot wheel. The pitch was that they could be owned, centralized, and billed. Power moved off the local stream and onto a wire that ran back to a company, and the company installed a meter on the side of your house, and the meter has been running ever since. Water power didn't lose because it failed. It lost because it couldn't be rented. And the most damning evidence that we abandoned something that worked comes from the Roman factory we started with. Because for most of modern history, we badly underestimated what it actually was. The Barbagal mills left almost nothing behind. The wooden wheels rotted away centuries ago. The masonry that's left just looks like empty stone basins climbing a hill. For a long time, that's all anyone could say about it. Then researchers realized the hard mineral scale, the same chalky lime scale that crusts up a kettle, had built up on the woodwork while the mills ran. And when the wood rotted, the scale was left behind as a perfect cast of the machinery. They pieced those fragments back together like a shattered mold. The deposits had grown in layers, season by season, the way a tree lays down rings, and those layers could be read. What they read rewrote the site. The chemistry showed the mills shut down for part of every year. Not random breakdowns, but a regular seasonal pause. The wheels and channels had been replaced every 3 to 8 years, the wear of constant heavy use. And the rhythm of the operation pointed somewhere nobody expected. This place may not have been baking daily bread for a nearby town at all. It looks like it was mass-producing hardtack, hard, dry, near-indestructible ship's biscuit, the kind that keeps for months, feeding the harbors and the ships and the soldiers moving through one of the busiest ports in the Western Empire. That's not a quaint old mill. That's a strategic industrial plant, scheduled around shipping seasons, churning out military and maritime rations on a slope in Gaul, powered start to finish by water that cost no one anything. As much as 25 tons of output on its best days from a machine with no fuel bill, no emissions, and no off switch anyone could reach. The stream that turned those 16 wheels is still running down that hillside in France today. The tide still pours through the inlet in Ireland twice a day. The rivers the Domesday mills sat on still flow past the foundations. None of the water that powered the ancient world ever stopped, not one drop of it. The wheel was never broken, it was never lost. It was taken off the table on purpose because a machine you can build yourself on a stream you already have is worth nothing to the people who'd rather you kept paying them by the month. They didn't bury this because it couldn't compete. They buried it because it could.